Kol Nidrei, the beginning of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. It's a time for reflection, repentance, and confession for the state of our lives and the condition of the world. And God knows this world and the human condition are suffering. While we have been struggling to persevere during the plague of COVID, it is the plague of racism and bigotry that confronts and shames this nation to our very core. Victims cry out in frustration and lamentation, and we need to find more than mere words with which to respond. And so tonight, I turn to Rabbi Hillel's famous call to action. He said, Im ein ani li mi li. וכשאני לעצמי, מה אני? ואם לא עכשיו, אימתי? If I am not for me, who will be for me? And if I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, then when? Hillel's teaching is both a call for self-preservation and a call for social responsibility. Both are sacred Jewish principles. Jewish prophets raised their voices and organized courageous protests to shout down the insolence, arrogance, and negligence and sinfulness in their days. They called out leaders and took them to task for tolerating that which is intolerable, namely the abuse of the most vulnerable in society, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. The voices of the prophets shook with rage against those who mistreated the poor and the weak. But the prophets spoke gently, with hope, and with compassion to those who suffered from poverty and prejudice. The words of the Hebrew prophets have sustained millions with hope, pride, and faith. Sadly, their visions have taken far, far too long to come true. Perhaps some can find solace in the fact that things are better now than they once were, but that's not very comforting to those who continue to experience racism and bigotry. Yes, the gates of freedom, justice, and enlightenment are swinging open, but too slowly. Slow change is not good enough for those who are suffering the torments of bigotry on a daily basis. The tragic history and brutal ordeal of the oppressed in the United States is a sin that must be confessed. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha, for the transgression for which we have sinned before you, O God, creator of all life, for our racism and bigotry, because we've harmed our brothers and sisters merely because of the color of their skin, or the manner in which they worship, the accent with which they speak, or the gender of those with whom they have fallen in love. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha, it is a sin that 155 years after the Civil War, we still have communities displaying statues and monuments that celebrate the pro-slavery Confederate leaders. Al chet, it is a sin that schools are underfunded in impoverished areas because they still rely on property taxes for support. Neglecting schools, underpaying teachers, perpetuates disadvantages by robbing children of a better future. We can do better. We need to do better. As Hillel said, if I am for myself alone, what am I? As Jews, we hear the words of Hillel as a call to action to come to the aid of all who are oppressed, of all who suffer the pain of poverty and the brutality of bigotry. We stand with our African American and black family, friends, and neighbors for equal justice, equal rights, equal protections, and equal opportunities. the first part of Hillel's message also needs to be addressed. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? Just as we need to be caring friends and partners with African Americans and blacks, Hispanics and immigrants and all who are vulnerable in society, we also have to react to the growing threat against Jews. Yes. There are concurrently rising rates of both racism and anti-Semitism. It's not surprising. In her important new book, Professor Deborah Lipstadt notes that anti-Semitism flourishes in a society that is intolerant of others, be they immigrants or racial or religious minorities. And she said, we are seeing both in this country. Lipstadt is famous for defeating in court a Holocaust denier, and she warns us about the rise of anti-Semitism around the world. She's careful to differentiate between anti-Semitism and racism. They are different in structure, in history, and contemporary impact. Racial minorities face daily prejudice and hatred. And though it was only a generation earlier during which Jews were denied job opportunities, faced admission quotas at schools, and were not able to buy homes in certain neighborhoods, those restrictions are largely illegal today. No, in the 21st century, Jews do not face the same disadvantages as African Americans and blacks. However, it is not uncommon for Jewish college kids to be harassed by radical professors and students who dismiss them as, quote, white or privileged and majority. Now in that context of the school, those labels are associated with oppression of minorities, that they are used to isolate and denigrate Jews as both unfair and nonsensical. The Jewish family is blessed with people from every race, nation, and background. White, black, Hispanic, Oriental, Asian, Middle Eastern, etc. An estimated 6 to 10% of Jews in America are Jews of color. And the majority of Jews in Israel are Middle Eastern. Regardless of our race, 35% of American Jews said they have experienced anti-Semitism in the past 5 years, and 1/3 admitted that they conceal outward displays of their Jewishness because they're afraid. The Anti-Defamation League reported over 2,000 significant anti-Semitic incidents in the United States just last year. That's an enormous increase from the past. Now, most violent racist and anti-Semitic incidents are perpetrated by extremists on the right wing, groups like the KKK and the neo-Nazis. And it was white supremacists who marched in Charlottesville, holding tiki torches and Nazi-like flags while chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And I don't care what your political affiliation is. It was a shameful episode in the history of this nation when the president did not respond to those racists appropriately, rather saying to them that they're among them very fine people. It was a message that empowered and gave a green light to the alt-right, white supremacists, and bigots. We're not surprised that the most violent extremists are on the far right. However, we are also witnessing anti-Semitism among extremists on the left. In her new book, Barry Weiss, formerly an editor and columnist with the New York Times, she documents the disturbing strength of anti-Semitism on both the right and the left. She notes how a growing number of progressive groups have created a litmus test for Jews, and this is what she says. Whereas once it was enough to criticize Israeli government policy, specifically its treatment of Palestinians, now Israel's very existence must be denounced. Whereas once Jewish success had to be merely explained, now it has to be apologized for. Whereas once only Israel's government was demonized, now it is the Jewish movement for self-determination itself. Weiss lists a number of examples, but ironically, Her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, was published before she was pushed out of the New York Times in July. The reasons she left the Times are heartbreaking for me, a daily subscriber to that nation's paper of record that, quote, offers all the news fit to print. Susan and I have been subscribing for over 30 years on a daily basis, the Times, and it just ripped us apart to read that she had been targeted by those on Twitter and the social media crowd for years, that it was her own colleagues on the New York Times that joined in, that broke her. They called her a Nazi, and they called her a racist, and they berated her for, quote, writing about the Jews again. And they took to social media, insisting that she be rooted out, even posting axe emojis next to her name. With all the harassment by the New York Times employees against Weiss, the paper never took action to protect her. As a professional journalist, however, it was Weiss who put herself in the arena. Unfortunately, that arena is growing increasingly hostile to Jews from both the extreme right and left. But what about those who are not in the arena? What about those who are students? A frightening outgrowth of anti-Semitism is the censure and elimination of Jews from certain organizations under the bigoted pretense that any Jew who is active in Jewish life might be pro-Zionist. And that puts them beyond the pale. The most recent example is the hounding of the former University of Southern California student government vice president, Rose Rich. She was bombarded at school with unrelenting protests because she identified as pro-Israel. She is a victim of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And that has permeated many campuses, not all, but many. An impeachment campaign was initiated against Rich. Now, you can imagine, think for yourself, back when you were 19, 20 years old, 21, you can imagine what kind of pressure she was under. As an undergraduate, having fellow students organize an impeachment campaign because she's Jewish. But let me conclude that sad saga with an uplifting note from Rose Rich herself. This USC student, after suffering an unconscionable emotional and social attack, refused to retract her pride as a Jew and as a Zionist. She wrote, "An attack on my Zionist identity is an attack on my Jewish identity. The suggestion," she said, "that my support for a Jewish homeland would make me unfit for office or would justify my impeachment plays into the oldest stereotypes of Jews, including accusations of dual loyalty and holding all Jews responsible for the actions of the Israeli government." I came from an undergraduate. Thank God for courageous young leaders like Rose Rich. My friends, just as we need to stand up for the rights of the most vulnerable in society, we also need to stand up for ourselves. If I am not for me, who will be for me? Our long history has taught us that if we are not for ourselves, we will suffer disastrous consequences. We must strengthen our Jewish families and our communities, both here, around the world, and in Israel. The joy and pride of our Jewish faith and heritage has provided a beacon of light to brighten the world. Society needs that light now more than ever. We must not allow anti-Semites from either extremes to extinguish our light. And yes, Jews must continue to strengthen our partnership with those who suffer at the hands of racists and bigots, because if we are for ourselves alone, what are we? Jews have always been and must continue to be at the forefront of civil rights, of equal rights, and justice for African Americans, blacks and Hispanics, immigrants, and gays and lesbians, and those who are transgendered. The Torah lists 36 variations of the mitzvah to love and protect those who are the most vulnerable in society. The Torah drives home that teaching by making it personal. It says, "The stranger who resides with you shall be with you as one of your own citizens. You shall love him or her. Love them as yourself, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt." We began the 2020, January, with a gathering right here in the Zwerin Sanctuary. There were African American and Jewish leaders. We came together to celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Well over 1,000 people crowded this sacred space as we came together to reaffirm the historic partnership between blacks and Jews. American Jews played a significant role in the founding and funding of the NAACP, as well as many other important civil rights movements. The Reform Movement's leader, Kivy Kaplan, served as the national president of the NAACP from 1966 to 1975, a decade of service. Jewish philanthropists like Julius Rosenwald were major contributors responsible for the creation of over 2,000 primary and secondary schools that served the impoverished communities. And they helped to establish over 20 black colleges, including Howard, Dillard, and Fisk. During the civil rights movement, Jewish activists represented a disproportionate number of those involved in the struggle. So when blacks and Jews came together this past January at Temple Sinai to pray and to sing, we did so in order to declare the need to renew that friendship. We had planned major events and initiatives to fulfill those aspirations. And though the pandemic caused a delay, God willing, the coming year will bring new opportunities for us to continue building bridges of blessing that signal a new era of cooperation. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? Indeed, the time is now. As we begin a new year, still reeling from a pandemic, natural disasters, a divisive political climate, and a society that is breaking apart, now is the time to stand up for that which is right and good, moral and ethical. Now is the time to stand proudly as Jews and react swiftly and passionately in defense of the most vulnerable of society. Now is the time when we lend our help to the collective weight of good people who join hands in order to turn the tide against racism and anti-Semitism. For now is the time to confront the extremists and the radicals on society's fringes, both right and left, those who try to plunge wedges and create divisions between us. The battle will not be easy. Bigots, racists, and anti-Semites pop up in surprising places. But we can prevail. We must prevail. May God inspire our heart, our spirit, our mindfulness, and our love to stand strong for justice, fairness, equality, and the work of peace. Ken hi ratzon. May it be God's will. Amen.